On the table in the main cabin of Coldwater Ranch, three things never moved. A tin coffee cup gone cold before it was ever fully drunk. A bank letter folded and unfolded so many times that the creases had worn white through the paper like old scars. And a pair of small leather boots, size 4 the right sole, worn thin at the big toe, the laces still tied in a bow that small hands had never learned to tie cleanly. Silas Pruitt never put those boots away. Every morning before he touched the coffee or read the letter again or stepped out into whatever Montana had waiting for him that day, he looked at those boots. He did not look at them the way a man looks at something he loves. He looked at them the way a man looks at something he deserves. That was enough. That was the whole of his religion now. Outside the Bitterroot Mountains stood against a sky the color of pewter, and the cold that came down off those peaks was not the friendly cold of early winter. It was February cold, the kind that had teeth and patience, the kind that had been waiting since October and was in no hurry to leave. The pines along the ridge held their snow like men holding a weight they had stopped noticing. The valley below was white and still and enormous, and Coldwater Ranch sat in the middle of it the way a single coal sits at the edge of a dying fire. Silas was already awake when the sky turned from black to gray. He had been awake since 3, which was usual. He lay in the dark with his eyes open and let the minutes pass the way you let water run over your hand, feeling it without trying to stop it. When the gray came, he got up. He dressed in the dark because there was no mirror in the cabin. He had taken the mirror down 18 months ago. He was not a vain man. It was not vanity that made him take it down. It was simply that he had caught his own face in it one morning and not recognized the man looking back at him, and he had decided it was easier not to look than to keep meeting that stranger every day. He pulled on his boots, his canvas trousers, his flannel shirt, his heavy wool coat that smelled of wood smoke and animal and long winters. He laced everything tight because that was how you kept the cold out. You left no gaps. You gave it nowhere to enter. He went to the kitchen and lit the stove and set the coffee on before he went outside. The cold hit him across the face like an open hand. He did not flinch. He had stopped flinching at cold the same year he stopped flinching at most things. He crossed the yard in long strides, his breath making small clouds that disappeared almost before they formed, and he went to the barn and then to the lower pasture where the herd had sheltered overnight. He counted. He always counted first before he let himself think anything else. Counting was a thing he could do correctly. 61, 62, 63. He stopped. In the far corner of the lower pasture near the fence line, where the old spruce grew sideways from years of wind, a cow had gone down in the night. She was lying on her side in the snow, and the way she was lying told him everything he needed to know before he got close enough to confirm it. He had seen enough of them go down in the past 4 months to know that posture, the stillness of it, the way the snow around them was disturbed from the final thrashing and then had gone smooth and white over everything. He walked to her. He stood over her for a moment. He noted the shriveled dark husks scattered across her hide, the same as the others, the same as all 18 of them before her. He took off his hat and held it against his chest because that was what you did, even for an animal, even when you had done it 18 times before, and the gesture felt like nothing more than habit. Then he went to get the shovel. The digging took 2 hours. The ground in February in Montana is not generous with a shovel. It gives itself up in small, hard increments, each strike ringing up through the handle and into your palms and forearms, each inch a negotiation. Silas dug without resting. His hat sat on the fence post beside him. His breath came in long, rhythmic pulls. He did not think about the cow. He did not think about the remaining 62 or the bank letter on the kitchen table, or the fact that Pharaoh's hired men had ridden along the southern fence line twice in the past week, slow and obvious about it, the way men are obvious when someone has paid them to be seen. He thought about nothing. That was a skill. He had spent 3 years developing it. When he came back inside, his father was already at the table. Roy Pruitt was 68 years old and had the hands of a man who had worked hard for all of them. Large hands, knuckled and careful, the kind that had once written lessons on a schoolhouse chalkboard in a fine, clear script, and had later learned to mend fence and pull calves and do all the things that a man must learn to do when life changes directions on him. Those same hands were wrapped around a pen now, moving slowly across a sheet of paper with a concentration that was almost painful to watch. Roy was dressed as if for church. White shirt buttoned to the collar, suspenders, his good wool trousers. His hair was combed, which meant he had known where the comb was this morning, which meant today was a good day. Silas stood in the doorway and watched his father write for a moment. Roy did not look up. "Another one," Silas said. "I know." Roy kept writing. I heard you go out." Silas hung his coat and washed his hands at the basin and set another log on the stove. He poured 2 cups of coffee and set one beside his father's right hand without being asked. Roy picked it up and drank without breaking the motion of the pen. "Today is a good day," Roy said. He said it the way a man reports weather, a simple fact offered without sentiment because they both understood what it meant and what it did not mean. "I can see that," Silas said. "I'm writing while I can." Silas did not ask what he was writing. He had learned not to ask certain questions, not because he did not want to know the answers, but because there were answers that Roy would give when he was ready, and asking before that time only confused the issue. His father was a private man with a precise mind, and the disease that had been working at that mind for 2 years now had not yet taken his privacy or his precision. It had only made them more urgent. Silas poured his own coffee and stood at the window looking out at the pasture. 62 head remaining. In August, there had been 104. He thought about the numbers the way a man thinks about a wound he is trying to assess in the dark, trying to determine how bad it is by feel alone. The bank letter on the table was from Harrington at Missoula National. Silas had read it so many times he could have recited it from memory. The language was polite in the way that language is polite when it is delivering a verdict. The ranch had been collateral on a loan taken out during the drought year of 1879, and that loan had been extended twice, and the extensions had run out, and the payment due in 10 days was not a payment Silas could make. 10 days. He rolled the number around in his mind, the way you roll a stone between your fingers, feeling its weight and edges. He had written to the matrimonial paper in October. Not out of loneliness, though he was lonely in the way that men who have spent 3 years alone in a large silent space become lonely, which is to say deeply and without drama and without much hope of it changing. He had written because Harrington's letter had contained a clause he had not expected. A clause that said the extension could be reconsidered, the terms renegotiated, if the deed holder could present a co-signatory with either personal assets or a legal spousal relationship to the primary borrower, a partner, or a wife. Silas had no partners. He had had friends, once men he had worked alongside and eaten with and trusted, but the years had distributed them elsewhere in the way years do, and the ones who remained nearby had their own troubles and their own reluctant dealings with Harrington at Missoula National. He was not a man who asked for things. He had never learned how. And then there was his father. Roy needed someone in the house when Silas was out working the land, which was most of every day. 3 weeks ago, Roy had walked out into the south pasture at 2 in the morning, wearing his nightshirt and his good boots and nothing else. And when Silas had found him half a mile from the cabin, Roy had been standing in the snow, looking up at the stars with perfect calm, not knowing where he was or who his son was or why it was cold. Silas had led him back and put him to bed and sat in the kitchen until morning arrived, drinking cold coffee and listening to the silence of the house. Something had to change. He was not enough alone. He had answered the advertisement because it was the only door still open. The reply had come 3 weeks later. Not from the matrimonial agency itself, but forwarded through it a single folded sheet in an envelope that had clearly traveled some distance. The handwriting was precise and small, economical, in the way of someone who had learned to make the most of available space. Ren Alcott, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I accept your terms as stated. I will arrive Friday on the afternoon stage. Please arrange to receive 2 heavy trunks. Do not dispose of any sick animals before my arrival. He had read that last sentence 4 times. Not I look forward to meeting you. Not I am eager to see Montana. Not any of the things a woman was supposed to write to a man she had agreed to marry. Do not dispose of any sick animals before my arrival. He had put the letter down on the table and looked at it for a long time. Then Edmund Farrow had come to visit. Farrow arrived at mid-morning with a bottle of good whiskey and the easy walk of a man who considers himself welcome wherever he goes. He was 58 years old and dressed better than any man in the valley, with a wool overcoat that had come from somewhere east and a silver watch chain that caught the light when he moved. He had been the primary partner at Stevensville Territorial Bank for 20 years, and before that he had been Roy Pruitt's closest friend, and before that he had been a young man from Ohio who had arrived in Montana with almost nothing and had spent the intervening decades converting almost nothing into a great deal of something. Silas had known Edmund Farrow his entire life. He had called him uncle until he was old enough to understand the word's imprecision. Farrow sat at the kitchen table and poured 2 glasses without being asked and talked about the weather and the price of cattle in Missoula and a new rail spur being discussed for the Northern Territory. He asked after Roy with genuine warmth. He expressed sympathy about the herd losses with an expression that said he had heard and was sorry. Roy sat in the corner chair throughout this visit. He had his eyes closed, which was not unusual. Pharaoh glanced at him once or twice with the careful attention of a man who is noting the condition of something he has an interest in. "You know," Pharaoh said, turning his glass slowly in his hands, "the offer I made last fall is still on the table. The eastern parcel alone would cover your obligations with Harrington and leave you enough to rebuild the herd. You'd keep the house, the barn, the home quarter. It wouldn't be charity, Silas. It would be business." "I know what it would be," Silas said. Pharaoh nodded slowly with the patience of a man who is accustomed to waiting for people to arrive at the conclusions he has already reached. He finished his whiskey and stood and buttoned his coat and shook Silas's hand with both of his. "Think on it," he said. "The offer has a limit. I'm a patient man, but I'm not an infinite one." He said goodbye to Roy, though Roy gave no sign of hearing. He walked to his horse and mounted with the ease of a man half his age and rode back up the valley road. Silas stood on the porch and watched him go. Behind him from the corner chair, Roy's voice came out clear and flat like a rock dropped into still water. "He came to see what you have left to take." Silas turned. Roy's eyes were open, not confused, not distant, clear and direct, looking at his son with the full weight of someone who had just said exactly what he meant. "Bah," Silas said, using the name he had called his father since childhood. But Roy had already closed his eyes again. Silas stood in the doorway between the porch and the kitchen for a long moment, looking at the old man in the chair. The fire in the stove ticked. Outside, the cold sat against the walls of the cabin and waited. That evening, after Roy had gone to bed and the last of the light had left the sky, Silas sat on the front porch steps with his coat buttoned to the throat and his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that was long past warm. The snow in the yard held the last gray light like a shallow basin holds water, and the stars above the Bitterroot Range were sharp and cold and very far away. He did not pray. He had stopped praying. The autumn Daniel died not out of anger at God, but out of a quiet and conclusive sense that prayer was a transaction, and he had nothing left to offer his side of it. He had not prayed at the funeral. He had not prayed when Ruth packed her 2 cases and asked the neighbor's boy to take her to the stage in Stevensville. He had not prayed on any of the 400 and some nights since. He just sat. The boots on the table inside caught the firelight through the window and through a small warm rectangle across the floor. He could see it from where he sat, that small square of orange light, domestic and ordinary, the kind of light that was supposed to mean someone was coming home. He did not know what he was waiting for. He did not know that the answer to that question was already on a train heading west. Wren Alcott had answered 17 matrimonial advertisements in 2 years. Not because she was lonely. She was lonely in the way that people who have spent too long among their own thoughts become lonely, which is a particular and inhabiting kind of loneliness that has less to do with the absence of people and more to do with the absence of anyone who understands the language you think in. But loneliness was not the reason she had written 17 letters to 17 strangers in 16 different territories. She had written them because she needed a ranch, a herd, and a man desperate enough not to ask too many questions. 16 times the man in question had looked at her leather satchel before he had properly looked at her face, and the look had said the same thing each time. The same slow tightening around the eyes, the same reassessment, the same polite or not-so-polite version of, "I see. Well, this is not what I expected." And then the door closing in one way or another. She had learned not to take it personally. She had also learned to carry the Remington in her coat pocket because the world was large and certain men interpreted a woman traveling alone as an invitation to renegotiate the terms of their interaction. She had not needed to produce the pistol in 3 months. She kept it loaded anyway. Her father had taught her that an unloaded weapon was a bluff, and Harlan Alcott had not raised his daughter to bluff. The stage came into Stevensville in the late afternoon with the sun already gone behind the western peaks and the light turning that particular shade of cold blue that preceded full dark in Montana. Wren had been traveling for 4 days. She had slept sitting up, eaten jerked beef and hard biscuit, and spent the last 12 hours wedged between a mining equipment salesman who snored and a pastor's wife who smelled of lavender and disapproval. She was tired in the bone-deep, precise way that extended travel produces, and she was alert in the way that she was always alert, which was completely and without interruption. She looked out the window as the stage slowed, taking inventory of Stevensville, the way she took inventory of everything quickly, methodically retaining what was relevant and discarding what was not. A main street of packed dirt frozen hard. A general store. A post office. A saloon with yellow light in the windows. A livery. A building that served as both church and schoolhouse, which told her something about the resources of the place. 20 or 30 people visible, none of them moving with particular urgency, all of them dressed for deep cold. A ranch town late in a hard winter. People conserving energy the way wood conserves itself, burning slow. She stepped down from the stage onto ground that was uneven with frozen ruts, and she did not stumble because she had expected the ground to be uneven. She stood straight and adjusted her coat and looked for the man she had agreed to marry. He was standing apart from the small gathering near the stage depot, partially in shadow, which told her he was either shy or careful or both. He was large, which she had not expected, though she supposed she should have. Men who carved ranches out of Montana wilderness tended toward the substantial. He stood 6 feet and some inches in heavy work boots broad across the shoulder, in a wool coat that had seen considerable use, wearing a wide-brimmed hat with the brim pulled low. His beard was dark and dense, and his face below the hat brim was the face of a man who had spent years in outdoor light and cold, all strong planes and deep lines, the kind of face that had arrived at its current configuration through experience rather than genetics. She looked at his hands, large, capable hands holding his hat now as he stepped forward. The knuckles were cracked from cold work. The nails were clean, which told her something. Men who kept their nails clean in the middle of a Montana winter either had standards or needed to believe they still had standards, and she found either interpretation acceptable. His eyes were the color of storm-wet granite, and they were doing the same thing her eyes were doing, which was to say they were assessing without the courtesy of pretending otherwise. "Miss Alcott," he said. His voice was low and careful. Not unfriendly, not warm. The voice of a man who chose his words with the knowledge that there were not infinite words available, and therefore each one should count. "Mr. Pruitt," she said. They looked at each other for a moment with the straightforward mutual evaluation of two people who have agreed to something significant and are now taking stock of whether the agreement was reasonable. There was no pretense in it on either side, which Wren found unexpectedly to be a relief. He helped load her trunks without comment, though she saw him note their weight. He said nothing about the weight. She had been prepared for a remark about the weight, had her response ready, but he did not make one. He simply adjusted his grip and loaded them efficiently and competently, and she revised several of her preliminary assessments upward by small but meaningful increments. They rode out of Stevensville as the dark came fully down, Wren behind him on the large gray horse he called Absalom, the pack mule with the trunks walking steadily behind on a lead. The road climbed through stands of pine and then opened onto valley floor, and the mountains showed themselves against a sky so black and clear and full of stars that Wren, who had grown up in Philadelphia and was not accustomed to skies that contained that much emptiness and that much light, simultaneously found herself looking up with something close to vertigo. She did not mention it. She noted it and filed it away with the rest of the things she was accumulating about this place. "I should tell you the situation plainly," Silas said. He was looking straight ahead between the horse's ears. "The letters I wrote you were true when I wrote them. The ranch has gone worse since. I've lost 18 head to sickness in 4 months, and the herd I have left is not healthy. I have an outstanding loan at Missoula National with 10 days until the final payment date, which I cannot meet." He paused. "I also have my father who lives in a cabin on the property. He has days when he is himself and days when he is not. He needs someone in the house." He said all of this without inflection, as if he were reading from the same bank letter he had been reading for weeks. No apology in it, no performance of remorse, just facts offered in sequence because she had the right to know them. Wren listened to all of it. When he finished, she said, "The warm spring near the grazing land. What direction does it flow from, and does it stay open through winter?" She felt him register the question without turning, a small adjustment in the set of his shoulders. "From the south," he said. "Never freezes. The ground stays soft around it all year." A pause. "Why?" "I need to see it," she said, "before I look at anything else." He did not answer immediately. The horses moved through the dark, their breath making small white ghosts in the cold air. "All right," he said finally. "Not why do you need to see a spring? Not what would a woman from Philadelphia know about springs? Just all right." She was beginning to think that Silas Pruitt's economy with language might be something other than unsociability. It might be intelligence. The ranch came into view as a collection of lights against the dark, which was the first indication that it was larger than she had expected. The main cabin was substantial, solidly built low to the ground in the way of structures that have been designed to survive rather than to impress. There were outbuildings and a large barn and several pasture enclosures, all of it laid out with the practical logic of someone who had thought carefully about workflow and distance and the relationship between where animals needed to be and where people needed to be in relation to them. She noted all of this. She also noted that the yard between the barn and the cabin had been shoveled clean and recently, which meant that despite everything else going wrong, Silas Pruitt kept his immediate ground clear. There was information in that. Inside the cabin, the smell of wood smoke and coffee, and the particular dry warmth of a space that has been heated all winter. A fire in a large stone fireplace, a stove in the kitchen, a table that had been used for eating and paperwork and everything else a table gets used for in a working household. 2 chairs. A wooden shelf with a few books which surprised her slightly and then did not surprise her. And on the table next to the bank letter, she could identify at a distance by its institutional envelope and the wear of its folds, a pair of small leather boots. Wren looked at the boots. She did not ask about them. She had learned a great deal about what not to ask, and the boots were in that category clearly and completely. In the corner chair near the fireplace, an old man sat upright in a posture that declared his origin. Not a man who had always been a farmer. A man who had once had a different relationship with rooms and furniture, and the requirement to hold himself in a way that announced intelligence. He was dressed formally for a weekday evening at home, white shirt and good trousers, and his eyes when they opened and found her were not the eyes of a man whose mind was absent. He looked at her for a moment, then he said, not asking, simply confirming, "You brought a microscope?" Wren stopped. In 16 previous attempts, no one had said anything like that to her. In all the letters and all the meetings and all the closed doors, not one person had arrived at that conclusion before she had offered it. "Yes," she said. Roy Pruitt nodded a single economical motion as if a small piece of something had resolved itself to his satisfaction. "Harlan Alcott's work," he said. "I read his reports in 1878. The Division of Entomology sent them to the Territorial Agricultural Office. I was on the Agricultural Committee that year." He looked at her steadily. He was right. They should have listened. Wren set her bag down carefully. She sat in the other chair, the one across from Roy's, and looked at this old man who was looking back at her with intelligence and recognition and something that might, if she let herself identify it, be called grief on her behalf. "He was right," she said. "And he paid for being right." "Yes." Roy closed his eyes. The fire moved. In the kitchen, Silas was doing something quiet with pots and water, giving them whatever this was between them. "You'll have a room to yourself," Roy said without opening his eyes. "The back one. Door locks from inside." "Thank you," she said. "Silas is a good man," Roy said. "He doesn't know that about himself anymore, but he is." Wren looked at the old man's profile, the strong old bones of it, the closed eyes that were not sleeping. She thought about her father saying something similar about someone a long time ago. She thought about what it meant to know someone well enough to defend them to a stranger in the spare and careful way that Roy Pruitt had just done. She did not say anything. There was nothing to say that would equal it. She went to her room and locked the door and unpacked what she needed for the night. She lit the lamp on the small table and opened her notebook to a fresh page. She wrote down everything she had observed about the ranch since arriving. The layout, the proximity of the warm spring to the grazing enclosures, the direction of drainage from the barn, the elevation relative to the water sources. She wrote down the number of sick animals as Silas had reported it. She wrote down the symptoms as she understood them from his letters. Then she opened the leather-bound research journal her father had maintained and turned to the section marked Montana Vector Survival Conditions, Geothermal Variants. She read until 2 in the morning. In the room across the cabin through the wall, she heard the sound of Silas returning from the barn, the slow, heavy steps of a man who had been working in cold since before dawn, the sound of him hanging his coat, the quiet of him not eating, which she noted, the sound of his door, then silence. She put down her father's journal and sat for a moment in the lamplight, listening to the cabin hold its breath around her. Outside, the wind moved through the pines along the ridge with a sound like distant water. She thought about 16 closed doors. She thought about her father's handwriting in the journal on the table, precise and certain and alive in the way that the writing of people who are gone remains alive, more present sometimes than the words of people who are still here. Her brother Thomas had written to her twice since she left Philadelphia. She had not written back. The first letter had been practical, asking where she was going and whether she needed money. The second had been shorter and harder to read, containing an apology she was not yet ready to receive, and a question she did not know how to answer: when are you coming home? She had folded both letters and put them at the bottom of the trunk beneath the reference texts, and had not looked at them since. There were things she was not prepared to explain to Thomas Chief, among them why she had left, and what she intended to find when she arrived wherever she was going. He had been there the night the laboratory burned. He had seen what she had seen, and he had made a different choice than she had about what to do afterward. That choice sat between them now like something that had been spilled and not cleaned up, and she did not know yet whether it was the kind of thing that could be cleaned up or the kind that simply dried into the surface of things permanently. She thought about the warm spring to the south, and then she extinguished the lamp and lay down in the dark and let the exhaustion of 4 days of travel finally do what it had been waiting to do, which was to take her under completely and without argument. She was asleep in minutes. In the kitchen on the table, the small leather boots sat in the dark beside the bank letter. The fire in the stove had burned down to coals. Outside, the Bitterroot Mountains held the cold and the silence and the enormous, indifferent stars. 3 days later, Silas Pruitt walked his new wife out to the warm spring at the southern edge of the grazing land, and the world that both of them had been living in quietly came apart and began to rebuild itself into something neither of them had been prepared for. He had not planned to go with her. She had said she wanted to go alone, and he had said this was his land and he would decide what happened on it, and she had looked at him with those precise green eyes and said, "Then come." Not an invitation, not a challenge, just an acknowledgement that the choice had been offered, and she was done negotiating it. They walked in silence through the lower pasture, past the spot where the 19th head had gone down that morning, which Silas did not look at, and which Wren did look at briefly, and with professional attention. The snow was deep enough to require effort, but not so deep as to impede. The sky above the valley was that particular hard blue of cold, clear days, the kind of blue that promises more cold. At the spring, Wren opened her satchel. She did not try to hide it. She opened it fully and set it in the snow and went to work with the methodical focus of someone who has done this many times and knows exactly what she is looking for. She took water samples. She took mud samples from the warm margins where the ground never froze. She took samples from the dry bank several feet back where the warmth did not reach. She labeled everything in her small, precise hand and sealed the vials and wrote in her notebook. Silas stood back and watched. He had known since the day the trunks arrived, and he had helped carry them to her room, that they contained more than clothes and household goods. He had known since the telegram, since those last 7 words, "Do not dispose of any sick animals." He had known that whatever Wren Alcott had agreed to when she agreed to come to Coldwater Ranch, it was not simply what the matrimonial advertisement had asked for. He had decided not to confront this knowledge until he understood it better. That was not patience exactly. It was the approach of a man who had learned that forcing a thing open before it was ready only broke it. He watched her work for 15 minutes, and what he saw in those 15 minutes was precision and purpose and the complete absence of uncertainty. She was not experimenting. She was confirming. She was looking for something specific, and she knew how to look for it, and she was not in any doubt about the process. When she finally straightened and capped the last vial and turned to look at him, he asked the only question that mattered. "Who are you?" She held his gaze. He had noticed in the 3 days she had been on the ranch that she did not look away from things. Most people looked away from things. They looked at the ground or the middle distance or some point just past your shoulder when they were managing a difficult conversation. Wren Alcott looked directly at the thing she was dealing with, which in this case was him, and she did not modify the look to make it easier to receive. "Someone who can save your ranch," she said. "If you give me time." She paused. "And if you trust me." He was quiet for a moment. Around them, the spring moved its slow, warm water through the frozen ground, and the mountains above the valley were sharp and white and enormous, and somewhere to the west, a raven called once and was silent. "How much time?" he said. 10 days. He looked at her. He looked at the spring. He looked at the 62 remaining animals in the upper pasture, visible from here as a dark cluster against the white field. "The bank also wants 10 days, he said. "I know." He turned and started back toward the cabin. After a moment, he said over his shoulder without stopping, "Tell me what you need." She stood at the warm spring with her sample case in her hand and the Montana cold around her, and watched Silas Pruitt walk back across his failing land with the steady, unhurried stride of a man who has decided to bet everything on a single remaining possibility. She did not allow herself to feel hope. Hope was imprecise, and imprecision was dangerous. What she allowed herself to feel was something closer to readiness, the quiet internal settling of a person who has been preparing for a long time for a thing that is finally about to begin. She picked up her satchel and followed him. Behind them, in the warm mud at the edge of the spring in the soft and heated ground that never froze even in the deepest Montana winter, something was waiting that had been waiting for months, patient and invisible, and doing its slow and certain work in the dark. She already suspected it was there. In 2 more days, she would know for certain. And in 10 days, the man who had put it there would come to collect what he believed was already his. The second day, Wren woke before the ranch did. She dressed in the dark without lighting the lamp, pulling on her heaviest wool skirt and the thick cotton shirt she wore as a base layer, and the practical gray coat that had traveled with her from Philadelphia, and showed it. She laced her boots at the edge of the bed and sat for a moment in the complete stillness of pre-dawn Montana, listening to the cabin breathe around her. Through the wall she could hear Roy's slow and even sleep. Through the front of the house, nothing, which meant Silas was already outside. She had noticed on this first morning that there was a window in which the cabin contained him, and a window in which it did not, and the second window began around 4 in the morning and ended when dark came back in the evening. He slept somewhere in between those 2 points briefly and without evident enthusiasm for the process. She went to the kitchen and lit the stove and set water to boil. While it heated, she stood at the window and looked out at the pasture in the first gray suggestion of light. She could see the shape of Silas moving along the fence line with a lantern, the small warm point of it swinging with his stride regular and methodical. She watched him for a moment. Then she went to her work. She had commandeered the end of the kitchen table nearest the window where the light would be best when the sun came up, and she had arranged her equipment there with the careful organization of someone who has learned through long experience that disorganization in a laboratory, however provisional, costs time, and time is always the resource in shortest supply. The brass microscope sat at the center. Around it, in precise order, her sample vials from the warm spring labeled and dated, her notebook open to yesterday's observations, her father's research journal tabbed to the relevant sections, a small spirit lamp for heating slides, a set of glass slides and cover slips in a wooden case, tweezers and lancets wrapped in oilcloth, 2 reference texts, one in English and one in German, both heavily annotated in 2 different handwriting styles, her father's and hers. The conversation they had been having in the margins of scientific literature for the better part of a decade. She prepared the first slide from the warm spring mud sample and set it under the lens and bent to look. What she saw confirmed what she had suspected, which was both a relief and not a relief in the way that confirmation of a difficult thing always carries both of those qualities simultaneously. The evidence was there, small and certain and entirely consistent with her father's documented findings from the Texas and Gulf Coast cases, the larval stage, the numbers, the distribution pattern. She sat back and wrote in her notebook without allowing herself to arrive at conclusions yet. Conclusions came after the work, not during it. Her father had been firm about this. He had been firm about this. Evidence first, interpretation after. The two must never share the same moment. She heard Silas come in, the particular sound of his boots heavier than any other sound the cabin made, the coat going on the hook, water at the basin. She did not look up from the notebook. He came to the kitchen and stopped at the edge of it, looking at what she had done to his table. She was aware of his pause without needing to see it. She had set up her equipment at 6 in the morning in a man's kitchen in 1883 Montana, and she was aware that this required some processing on his part. He poured coffee. He set a cup beside her notebook without comment. He made himself eggs at the stove. "How many did you lose last night?" she asked, still writing. "None." A pause. "One this morning, before I went out." She wrote that down. Where was she grazing? Lower pasture, south quarter near the creek drainage. She wrote that down too. "And the ones you've lost, have they consistently been from the southern sections?" The silence from the stove told her he was thinking about it, going back through it, reordering the sequence of losses against the geography of the ranch. "Yes," he said finally. "I didn't mark it that way. But yes." She looked up for the first time. He was standing at the stove with a spatula and looking at her with an expression she was beginning to identify as his version of interest, which was a very restrained thing, but present if you knew to look for the specific set of the eyes. "That matters," she said. "I can see that it does," he said. "I don't yet understand why." "I'll explain it when I'm certain." He nodded and went back to his eggs. She went back to her slides. After a while, Roy came out in his good shirt and suspenders, moving carefully with the particular carefulness of mornings when the machinery of a person's body needs time to remember its job. It was not a good day. Not fully. He sat at his end of the table and drank his coffee and looked at Wren's equipment with an expression of qualified interest, not quite reaching the sharp recognition of the previous evening. "Instruments," he said. "Yes," Wren said. "Harlan's. Some of them. Some are mine." Roy picked up his coffee cup and held it in both hands and looked at the microscope. He had one like this. Smaller. German-made. "Zeiss," Wren said. "This is the same manufacturer. Newer model." Roy nodded slowly. He looked like a man pulling something up from a depth hand over hand. "He showed me once. What the blood looked like. Under the glass." He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't understand it, but I understood that he did, and that it mattered." Wren looked at the old man. She thought about her father showing someone the slide of infected blood, taking the time to explain it to a farmer on an agricultural committee, believing that the understanding of ordinary people mattered to science as much as the understanding of scientists. He had always believed that. It had been one of the things that made him exceptional, and one of the things that had made him vulnerable, because people who believe that truth is accessible to everyone tend to underestimate the number of people who have a financial interest in keeping particular truths inaccessible. "He was like that," she said. "He always wanted people to see for themselves." Roy set down his cup. "Sit down to breakfast," he said to neither of them specifically. "The work will still be there after." It was not a question. They both sat down. This became the first of their mornings. On the second day, Wren went out with Silas to the pasture and showed him what she was looking for on the hides of the living animals. He watched her hands work through the winter coat of a cow with efficient gentleness, parting the hair along the neck and behind the ears and along the belly where the skin was thinner, finding what she was looking for and dropping it into a vial with tweezers. "There," she said. She held the vial up so he could see it against the gray winter light, small and dark and swollen with its terrible patient industry. "That is what is killing your cattle." Silas looked at the vial. His face did not change, but she had begun to understand that his face not changing did not mean nothing was happening behind it. "A tick," he said. "A specific tick. Buphalus annulatus. It carries a blood parasite that destroys red blood cells. The animal essentially starves in its own body." She capped the vial. "Your ranching community calls it Texas fever, or blood fever. The name is misleading because it is not a fever, not in origin. The parasite causes the fever, but the tick causes the parasite." He was quiet for a moment. "And you can stop it." "I believe I can treat what is already infected and prevent further transmission. But I need to understand first how this population of ticks is surviving a Montana winter. The cold should kill them. The larval stage cannot survive ground temperatures below freezing." She looked toward the south. "But your warm spring does not freeze." She saw it land, watched him look toward the spring and then back at the sick animals, and then reassemble what he understood about his land around this new piece of information. "Someone brought them here," he said. It was not a question. He had arrived at it faster than she had expected, with the directness of a man who had not spent years in laboratories and therefore had not developed the laboratory scientist's caution about reaching conclusions before all the evidence was secured. He had simply looked at the geography and the logic and arrived at the answer that the geography and the logic indicated. "That is what I am trying to confirm," she said carefully. "But you already believe it." She held his gaze. "Yes." He looked at the warm spring for a long time. She could see something working in him, something held very still under the surface the way deep water holds its current below a calm exterior. "All right," he said. He looked back at her. "What do we do first?" She began to explain. He listened the way he did everything, which was completely and without interruption, and without the particular male habit of waiting for a pause in which to insert his own interpretation. He asked questions when she finished, and the questions were good ones, specific and practical, focused on the relationship between what she was describing and what he already knew about his land. On the third day, he began to use the terminology she had introduced. Not all of it, not fluently, but he retained the relevant terms and deployed them accurately. Vector, larval stage, transmission cycle. She noticed this and did not comment on it, but she filed it away with the other things she was accumulating about Silas Pruitt, which were becoming numerous and varied, and not what she had expected. On the 5th day, she found the pine branch on the table. She had gone out before dawn to collect a second round of samples from the spring and come back to find that sometime in her absence, Silas had set a small pine branch with a cluster of cones on the edge of her workspace in the corner where the microscope met the wall. It was not a large gesture. It was a very small one, a sprig of green in a season of white and gray. There was no note. He was already outside. She looked at it for a long moment. She thought about the small leather boots and the way they sat on that table every morning, like a vigil. She thought about a man who had stopped making gestures in the world, who had organized his life around their absence, who woke at 3 in the morning and went to work in the dark because the alternative was to be still. She thought about what it meant that he had made this one. She put her hand briefly on the pine branch, feeling the sharp cool of the needles. Then she went to work. She did not mention it to him. But the next morning she left a cup of coffee on the porch railing at exactly the time she calculated he would come around the corner of the barn on his morning circuit, and when she looked out 20 minutes later, the cup was empty and back on the railing, and he was already in the far pasture. She brought the cup inside and washed it and put it away and went to her table. This was the language they were developing. Small and precise and without excess. A grammar built of practical gestures and careful silences, and the slow accumulation of evidence that the other person could be trusted with the next small thing, and then the one after that. Roy watched all of this from his corner with an expression that contained satisfaction and said nothing. On the 6th day, he had a bad morning. He did not know Silas when Silas came in for coffee, called him by a name that was not his name, and when Silas said gently, "It's me, Ba, it's Silas." Roy looked at him with the particular bewilderment of someone who cannot reconcile what they are hearing with what they believe they know, and then he went somewhere inside himself for a while where they could not follow. Silas sat with him. He did not try to pull him back. He just sat, one large hand on the arm of his father's chair present, and quiet, waiting with the patience of someone who understood that you could not rush certain kinds of returning. Wren saw this from the kitchen doorway and looked away quickly. Not because it was painful to see, but because it was private in a way that had nothing to do with modesty and everything to do with the specific intimacy of watching someone love a person they are in the process of losing. She went outside and walked to the barn and checked on the 3 animals she had already begun treating. Goliath, the large breeding bull, was the most critical. He had been down for 2 days. She had administered the first treatment the afternoon she arrived, when she had understood from his symptoms and his position in the south pasture and the particular dullness of his eyes that he was within days of not coming back from it. He was standing now, barely, his weight against the barn wall, his breathing slow and labored, but standing. She ran her hands along his neck and checked his temperature and examined his eyes and wrote in her notebook, and did not allow herself to feel anything about the fact that he was standing until she was done with the assessment and the writing and had closed the notebook and capped the pen. Then she stood with her hand on his neck and let herself feel it for 30 seconds, the quiet, fierce satisfaction of an intervention that was working, the thing her father had felt every time a sick animal turned back toward health under his hands. 30 seconds. Then she went back inside. On the 7th evening, Silas asked her to walk with him to the upper ridge to check the fence line before dark. She put on her coat and went. They walked without speaking for a while, the snow compressing under their boots, the sky going from blue to violet to the first suggestion of stars. At the ridge he stopped and looked out over the valley. She stopped beside him. Below, the lights of the cabin were small and warm against the white ground. The Bitterroot Range was turning black against the darkening sky, enormous and close in the clear winter air. "I haven't been up here since September," he said. She looked at the view. She understood what he meant, which was not that he had been too busy, but that there had been no one to walk up here with, and the view from a ridge without anyone to share it with is not a view, but a confrontation with scale. "It's extraordinary," she said. "Yes." They stood in that for a while. The cold was settling in around them, coming down from the peaks in slow waves, and the stars were beginning to show themselves one by one in the east. "My son liked it up here," Silas said. She did not turn to look at him. She kept her eyes on the valley. "His name was Daniel," he said. The words came out with the careful deliberateness of something that has been held in so long that speaking it requires a different kind of effort than ordinary speech. "He was 4 years old. I was in the North Wilderness 3 days hunting. He went to the creek behind the cabin." A pause. "Ruth found him." Wren was quiet. Below Absalom moved across the yard a dark shape in the failing light. "I don't tell people that," Silas said. "I don't know why I'm telling you." She thought about it honestly, standing in the cold on the ridge above his failing ranch. She thought about why people tell things to certain people and not others. She thought about what she was doing here, what she had come for, what she had expected to find, and what she was finding instead. "Perhaps because I haven't asked you to be anyone other than who you are," she said. He considered this for a long moment. "Perhaps," he said. They stood together until full dark came and then walked back down to the cabin in silence, but it was a different silence than the one that had been between them before, which had been the silence of two people being careful. This was the silence of two people who had just put something down and found that their hands were lighter without it. On the 8th morning, Wren woke at 4 and lay in the dark for a full minute before she got up, which was unusual. She lay there and listened to the cabin and the cold outside and the particular quality of a pre-dawn silence that had something different in it than the pre-dawn silences before. She was close to something. She could feel it the way her father had told her. You eventually learn to feel the edge of a significant finding, not with excitement exactly, but with a kind of heightened attention. Every faculty oriented toward the same point, the way a compass needle orients to north before you have even looked at it. She dressed and went to the kitchen and prepared a slide from the soil sample she had taken the previous afternoon from the deepest margin of the warm spring where the mud was hottest and the ground gave way to something almost gelatinous beneath the surface. She put the slide under the lens. She looked for a long time. Then she sat back and looked at the wall of the cabin in the way of someone who has just confirmed something they suspected and is now required to decide what to do with that confirmation. She went back to the spring. She went alone, taking only her sample case and a short-handled shovel she borrowed from the barn, and she walked the southern pasture in the dark with a lantern moving carefully and methodically along the warm margin of the spring from its northern edge to where it disappeared into a rocky channel to the south. She was looking at the ground the way she had been trained to look at the ground, which was with total attention to what was actually there rather than what she expected to find. What she found was not what she had expected. Or rather, it was what she had suspected, and the confirmation of it was worse than the suspicion, as it generally is when the thing you suspected is a deliberate human act rather than an accident of nature. 3 sections of the warm mud bank showed evidence of repeated disturbance. Not animal disturbance, which has a characteristic randomness to it, a chaos of overlapping tracks and irregular digging. Human disturbance, which is orderly, which has edges, which repeats in the same place because the person doing it knew where to go. She dug in the first section and found it at 14 inches depth, a burlap sack partially decomposed. Its contents long since dissolved into the surrounding mud, but the stitching of the fabric still identifiable, and more importantly, the specific pattern of the weave, which was the kind used for cattle hide transport. The second section yielded the same, more decomposed, older. The third section, which was closest to the main flow of the spring where the water was warmest and the ground most active, yielded something that had not yet fully broken down. She pulled it out with gloved hands and held it in the lantern light and looked at what it was, confirming what she already knew. It would be a section of cattle hide from a southern animal, a Texas or Gulf Coast animal, which she could identify by the specific characteristics of the hide. An animal that had been heavily infested with Buphalus annulatus, the Texas tick, at the time of its death. The hide had been brought here from somewhere far south and buried in the warmest ground on this ranch, in the only spot where the soil temperature never dropped below the threshold required for larval survival through a Montana winter. Someone had created an incubator. Someone had engineered this, and then someone had come back. The second disturbed section proved it to refresh the supply when the first load had broken down. This was not opportunistic. This was a campaign. She sat back on her heels in the snow and held the lantern and looked at what she had uncovered and let the full weight of it settle over her. She thought about her father's laboratory burning. She thought about the particular kind of person who calculates that destroying a man's research is worth the effort because the research threatens their profit. She thought about Edmund Farrow's silver watch chain catching the light in Silas Pruitt's kitchen. She did not have a name yet. She had a method and a pattern and a starting point. She reburied everything as carefully as she could, marking the locations in her notebook with precise measurements so she could find them again, and walked back to the cabin. Silas was in the kitchen when she came in. He looked at the shovel and the state of her boots and her coat, and did not ask where she had been because the evidence of where she had been was evident. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She put her notebook on the table and opened it to the new pages and turned it so he could see the diagrams and the measurements and the notes written in her careful hand. She told him what she had found. She told him all of it cleanly and in sequence, and she watched his face as she did. His face did not give much, but she had been watching it for 8 days now, and she could read the specific quality of his stillness and what she saw in him as she told him about the buried hides and the engineered incubation and the repeated visits was not surprise. It was the particular internal shift of someone who has just been given the evidence for something they already at some level knew. "Someone has been doing this for months," she said. "At minimum, possibly since last spring." He was quiet. "Someone who knows this land," she continued, "who knew about the warm spring and understood what it would do with what they put in it. Someone with access to southern cattle hides, which means connections to Texas or Gulf transport routes." Silas looked at her notebook. He looked at the diagram she had drawn, the precise topography of the spring and the marked locations of the 3 buried sections. "Pharaoh," he said. She had been waiting for it. She had not wanted to say it first, had not wanted to lead him toward it, because a conclusion that a man reaches himself carries a different weight than one delivered to him. "I don't have proof of that yet," she said carefully. "But you suspect it. I have a financial pattern that is consistent with a deliberate strategy of ranch acquisition through engineered livestock loss. I have a method. I need documentation to connect a specific individual to that method and that pattern." "Where does the documentation exist?" "Property records. Land transaction records. The Territorial Property Registry Office in Missoula maintains public records of all land transfers." She held his gaze. "I need to see who has been buying the ranches in this valley and when and whether the timing correlates with disease outbreaks in each case." He was quiet for a long moment. Outside the window, the morning was coming up gray and flat and cold, the light spreading slowly across the white ground. "Missoula is half a day's ride," he said. "I know. The roads are passable. I know that too." He stood up from the table and looked at the notebook again and then looked at her. "We go tomorrow morning," he said. "Early." She nodded. He put on his coat and went outside. She sat at the table for a moment in the wake of his decision and felt something she recognized as the specific relief of having a partner who, when presented with a difficult and consequential thing, responds by asking what must be done next rather than by questioning whether the thing is real. She had not had that before. Not since her father. She picked up the notebook and went back to work. That evening Roy had a very good hour. It came after supper unexpectedly, as the good hours sometimes did, arriving without announcement and carrying within them a quality of presence and precision that was startling after a day of fog. Roy put down his coffee cup and looked at Wren with the direct, clear eyes of his best moments and said, "Tell me what you found." She told him. All of it: the slides, the warm spring, the buried hides, the pattern. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he sat for a while with his hands folded on the table, and the look on his face was one she recognized from the hours she had spent with him each evening this past week, the look of a man pulling something up from a very deep place. "Edmund lost everything in '73, Roy said finally. "The panic. Lost the farm in Ohio. Lost money he had borrowed from people who trusted him. Lost something else too, something that doesn't have a name, that a man loses when he goes from having to not having very quickly and publicly." He looked at the table. "He came to Montana the year after. He came with nothing. He told me once that he had decided he would never be in that position again. Those were the exact words. That position. As if poverty were a physical location he had visited and refused to return to." He paused. His eyes moved to the window and then back. "I thought he meant it the way most men mean it when they have been poor and worked their way out of it. I thought he meant he would be careful, disciplined, save." A long pause. "I did not understand that he meant it without limit." Wren looked at this old man who had known Edmund Pharaoh for 30 years, who had watched him become what he was, who was sitting in the kitchen of the son whose land Pharaoh had been methodically destroying. And she understood that what Roy was doing was not defending Pharaoh, but trying to explain how a person who had been good or adjacent to good arrived at a place where they were capable of this. "I'm sorry," she said, "that you were his friend and he did this." Roy looked at her steadily. "I'm sorry that your father did the right thing and paid the price for it." They sat with that for a moment, the exchange of one grief for another, both of them recognizing that the world contained people like Harlan Alcott who paid for being right, and people like Edmund Pharaoh who profited from making sure the right people could not be heard, and that this was not new and was not going to be resolved by any single act of justice, however satisfying. "Go to Missoula," Roy said. "Look at the records. Come back with what you find." He closed his eyes. The good hour was ending. Silas had been standing in the doorway to the hall, and Wren had known he was there and had not indicated it. He came into the kitchen now and refilled his father's cup gently, and Roy accepted it without opening his eyes, and Silas looked at Wren across his father's white head, and she looked back at him. There was something moving between them in that look that neither of them had words for yet, and perhaps neither of them needed words for it yet, because it was the kind of thing that words can close off as easily as they can open up, and they were both careful enough and damaged enough to know that some things need to be approached very slowly and from a long way off. She went to her room. He sat with his father until the old man fell asleep in the chair. They rode to Missoula the next morning before the sun came up. The Territorial Property Registry occupied 2 rooms at the back of the county administrative building maintained by a clerk named Oswald, who was not accustomed to women requesting access to land transaction records, and who said so in the particular way of men who state an unusual condition, not as a complaint but as a fact they expect to settle the matter. Silas stepped to the counter. He did not raise his voice. He simply set his hand on the wood and said, "This is my wife. She's asking about our land. Get the records." The records came out. Wren worked through them for 2 hours at a standing table near the window while Silas waited on a bench outside in the cold, which was what she asked him to do because she needed to be able to think without managing anyone else's presence. What she found was worse than what she had projected and more complete than she had hoped for. 11 ranches in the Bitterroot Valley, all of them transferred in the past 5 years, all of them at prices significantly below assessed value. All of them transferred after documented periods of livestock illness and financial difficulty. The buyer in each case was not Faro directly, but a holding company, a territorial land trust with an address in Helena, and the authorized signatory on each document was the same E. Faro trustee. 11 ranches, 5 years. The same pattern repeated with the confidence of a man who had done it before and expected to continue. And there, in the oldest of the records, the one that predated the current run by 12 years, a land transfer from 1871. The seller, Roy Pruitt. The stated reason, failure to satisfy outstanding loan obligations. The buyer, the same holding company, same signatory, different name, then a different shell, but the same handwriting, the same notarial seal, the same Edmund Faro behind it. Silas's family land. Taken in 1871 when Silas was 9 years old, and Roy was a young man with everything still ahead of him. She stood very still for a moment looking at that document. Then she took out her notebook and wrote down every relevant detail with complete precision, every name and date and amount, every case number and notarial reference, because she was her father's daughter, and her father had taught her that documentation is not secondary to evidence. Documentation is evidence, and that the difference between a finding and a proven finding is the paper that supports it. She closed the notebook. She went outside. Silas was on the bench with his coat buttoned and his hat pulled down and his hands on his knees looking at the street with the patient blankness of someone who has learned to wait. He looked up when she came out. He read her face the way he had begun to learn to read her face, which was by not looking for large signals, but for the small ones, the particular set of her jaw, the quality of her attention. He stood up. "Tell me," he said. She told him. Standing on the frozen street in Missoula, Montana, with the cold coming down from the mountains and the commercial noise of the town around them, she told him what she had found. All of it, including the 1871 document. He stood very still while she talked. When she was done, he looked away down the street for a long time, and she let him have that time, not filling it with anything, because there are things a person needs to stand alone inside for a moment before they can move forward from them. He turned back. His face was the same as it always was, composed and controlled, giving almost nothing. But his eyes had something in them she had not seen before, something that was not grief and not rage, but the specific cold clarity that comes when a long-suspected thing is finally confirmed and a person must decide what to do with the confirmation. 12 years, he said. At minimum, she said. My father knew. I believe so. Yes. He was quiet. That's what he's been writing. She nodded. He looked at the building behind her, at the sign above the door, at the street stretching north toward the valley, and his ranch and his 62 remaining animals and his father's cabin and the warm spring where someone had buried the instruments of his ruin. "We go back," he said. "Yes." "And then what?" She looked at him steadily. She had been thinking about this since she sat down at the standing table in the records room. She had been thinking about it since the warm spring. She had been thinking about it in truth since the day she answered his advertisement, because she had known that the end of this, if the end came correctly, would require more than science. "Then we build the case," she said. "Every piece of evidence in its proper order, the biology, the land records, your father's testimony, and we present it in front of the sheriff and whoever Pharaoh brings with him when the deadline comes, and we let the law do what it is supposed to do. And if the law doesn't," she held his gaze, "then we make it very expensive for it not to." He looked at her for another moment, a long moment in which she was aware of him seeing her in some way that was more complete than the way he had been seeing her, as if the 2 hours she had spent in that records room had resolved something about her that had still been uncertain before. "All right," he said. They rode back as the afternoon light failed, and the cold deepened, and the mountains came up around them enormous and indifferent, the same as they had always been. They rode mostly in silence, which was by now their natural condition, a silence that had become habitable and even comfortable in the way of silences between people who have stopped performing ease and started simply being in each other's presence. Halfway back, with the last light going red above the western peaks, Silas said without preamble, "My father used to bring me up into the hills when I was small, before the land was sold. He'd point out the property lines, every stone and tree that marked the boundary. He'd say, 'This is yours. Learn it.'" Wren listened. "He said it enough times that I knew every corner of that land before I was 7, every creek and rise and low spot." A pause. "When we moved to Coldwater, I kept doing it, walking the boundary, learning the corners. I never asked him why we moved. I was 9. I thought adults had their reasons, and the reasons were their own." The horses moved through the darkening valley. Stars were beginning to show in the east. "He was protecting me from it," Silas said. "From knowing. Yes. He's been carrying it all this time. He waited until he could give you something to do with it," she said. "He didn't want to give you the wound without the means to answer it. He was quiet for a long time after that." She did not fill the quiet. When they came over the last rise and saw the lights of Coldwater Ranch below them, small and warm against the immense white dark of the valley, Silas pulled Absalom gently to a halt for a moment and sat looking down at it. She stopped beside him. "We have 2 days before Pharaoh comes," he said. "Yes. Is it enough?" She thought about what still needed to be done. The treatment trough to be built, the remaining animals to be processed, Roy's testimony to be formally recorded, the evidence to be organized and ordered and prepared for presentation, a message to be sent to the territorial marshal's office in Helena, which Thomas had said 3 days ago by letter that he would handle and which she had not yet confirmed was in motion. "It will have to be," she said. He looked at the lights below for another moment. Then he touched his heels to Absalom's sides, and they rode down toward the ranch, toward Roy's lamp in the window, toward whatever the next 2 days would require of them. And the cold came with them, and the stars came with them, and the mountains stood around it, all permanent and without opinion, as they had always stood. Halfway across the lower pasture, Goliath appeared out of the dark. He walked to the fence line and stood there, a large, dark shape in the starlight, watching them pass. His breathing was even. His head was up. Wren looked at the bull in the dark and thought about her father's voice saying, "The work tells you what is true." She knew what was true. Now she had 2 days to make it matter. The morning of the 9th day came in without ceremony. No dramatic light over the Bitterroot Peaks. No break in the cloud cover that had been sitting over the valley since midnight. Just the slow gray arrival of a winter morning in Montana, the kind that offers nothing and makes no promises, the kind that says, "Here is another day, and what you do with it is entirely your own concern." Silas was outside before 4. He had not slept past 3 in years, but this night he had not slept at all, or not in any meaningful way, which was different. He had lain in the dark and looked at the ceiling, and let the hours pass with a particular quality of wakefulness that was not anxiety, not exactly, but was adjacent to it. The quality of a man who has been moving toward something for a long time and can now feel the edge of it under his feet and understands that the next step will be off solid ground. He pulled on his coat and his hat and went out into the dark. The cold came at him immediately, purposeful and total, and he walked into it the way he walked into everything, which was directly and without adjusting his pace. He crossed the yard. He went through the gate at the lower pasture. He walked the fence line south. He was not checking on anything in particular. He was doing what he had always done in the hours before dawn, when the ranch required thinking about which was to walk its perimeter and let his feet and the ground speak to each other while his mind sorted through what needed sorting. But tonight, he was not walking to think about the ranch. He was walking to think about his father. Roy had been awake when Silas came in from Missoula the previous evening. Not a good hour, not fully, but present enough to take his supper and sit by the fire while Wren was in her room preparing documents and Silas was in the kitchen trying to make sense of the past 12 years with the new information the Missoula records had given him. Roy had sat in his chair and looked at the fire and said nothing for a long time, and then he had said with the careful enunciation of someone choosing each word from a diminishing supply, "Did you find what the girl was looking for?" "Yes," Silas had said. Roy had nodded. "Good." A pause. "The writing is in the tin box, under my bed. If I can't speak tomorrow, the writing says everything." Silas had stood very still in the kitchen. "You'll be able to speak tomorrow, Ba." Roy had looked at the fire. "Maybe, maybe not. The box is there either way." He had gone to bed shortly after moving down the hall with the careful steps of a man who is conserving something. Silas had gone to his room and sat on the edge of his bed in the dark for a long time, thinking about his father, writing in the pre-dawn hours of every good day, the white shirt always buttoned the pen, moving with that painful, deliberate care, writing while he could, saving what he knew for a day, when knowing would be needed. 12 years of silence and now this. A tin box under a bed. He walked the fence line until he reached the southern boundary where the warm spring ran its quiet course through the dark, and he stood there for a while looking at the place where the mud stayed soft and the grass pushed up in thin yellow shoots even in February, anomalous and persistent, a small pocket of false spring in the middle of a real winter. He thought about the 9-year-old boy who had walked property lines with his father and learned every corner and stone, who had been told, "This is yours," learn it not knowing that the man saying it was carrying the knowledge that it was already gone, that the ground under their feet had already been taken by the specific and patient malice of a man his father called a friend. He thought about Roy carrying that for 30 years. He thought about what it costs a man to carry something like that, what it takes out of you over decades, what it does to the way you hold yourself in the world when you know the truth of something and cannot speak it, because speaking it would require your son to act on it. And your son is 9 years old, and then 14, and then 20, and then there are other griefs arriving bigger and more immediate, and the old wound gets pushed deeper by the weight of the new ones piling on top. He took off his hat. The cold air moved through his hair and across his forehead, and he stood in it with his face up and his eyes open, and let it do that. He had spent 3 years punishing himself for Daniel, waking before light and working past dark and allowing himself no comfort and no company and no relief, as if the quantity of suffering he was willing to absorb might eventually balance some account that was demanding payment. As if the universe kept ledgers and he could satisfy his debt through sustained deprivation. He understood now, standing at the warm spring in the dark with his hat in his hand, that his father had been doing the same thing for 30 years. A different debt, a different ledger, the same impossible arithmetic. And neither of them had been right about it. He put his hat back on. He turned and walked back toward the cabin where the lamp in Wren's window had been burning since 3 in the morning, because she had told him she needed the time and the quiet to prepare what needed to be prepared, and she was in there doing that now with the focused, unsentimental competence that she brought to everything. And he thought about what Roy had said on the first night. She doesn't look at you the way most people do. She looks at you like she's going to believe what she finds. He went inside. Roy was already at the table. White shirt, good trousers, the pen in his hand. The morning was barely beginning, and his father was already dressed and writing, and Silas stood in the doorway of the kitchen looking at him and understood that Roy had also not slept, that his father had spent the same night in the same kind of wakefulness and had gotten up before dawn to use whatever this day gave him while it was still good. Roy looked up. His eyes were clear. It was a good day. Silas came to the table and sat across from his father and did not reach for the coffee or say anything about breakfast or do any of the things that mornings normally required. He put his hat on the table between them and looked at his father. Roy set down his pen. They looked at each other for a long moment. Two men of the same blood sitting across a wooden table in the early morning with the fire in the stove and the cold outside, and 12 years of unspoken truth between them, and only one day left in which it mattered. "I should have told you," Roy said. "You told me when it could do something," Silas said. Roy shook his head slowly. I waited because I was afraid of what you'd do. And then I kept waiting because the waiting had become its own habit." He looked at his hands on the table. "That was cowardice, Silas. An old man's cowardice dressed up as protection. You were protecting me. I was protecting myself from watching you take on a fight I thought you couldn't win." He paused. "I was wrong about that." Silas was quiet. "I was wrong about a lot of things," Roy said, "but I was not wrong about her." They both knew who he meant. "No," Silas said. "You weren't wrong about her." Roy picked up his pen again and looked at the papers in front of him, the careful accumulated pages of his good days. "The testimony is complete. Every date, every amount, every conversation I can remember with specificity, the transfer documents I witnessed, the loan records that were falsified, the name of the notary Pharaoh used, who is now dead and therefore cannot be compelled but whose signature is documented." He looked up. "It is as thorough as I could make it." "It's enough," Silas said. "I hope it is." Roy looked at his son steadily. "I need you to know something, Silas. Not for today. For after today, when this is settled one way or another." Silas waited. "Daniel would be 7 years old this spring," Roy said. "He would have been a difficult child, curious about everything, impossible to contain." A pause, something moving through the old man's face that was not grief, but was the shape that grief leaves behind when it has been held a long time and has finally been given permission to settle. "He would have been exactly like you at that age, which means he would have been extraordinary." Silas looked at the table. "You are not responsible for the creek being where it was," Roy said. "You are not responsible for a 4-year-old boy doing what 4-year-old boys do. You were in the wilderness doing what kept this family alive." He stopped. "Ruth knew that. She left because she needed to, not because you failed her. That is different." The fire in the stove ticked. Outside, the gray morning was gathering itself into something that might become a day. Silas kept his eyes on the table for a long time. Then he reached across and put his hand over his father's hand on the pen, the large cracked hand covering the old spotted one, and he kept it there. Roy turned his hand over and held his son's hand in both of his. They sat like that in the kitchen with the lamp and the fire and the cold outside, and neither of them said anything else because everything that needed saying had been said, and what remained required no words at all. Wren appeared in the kitchen doorway with her notebook and stopped. She saw them. She started to withdraw. Roy said without looking up, "Come in, girl. There's coffee on the stove and we have work to do." She came in. She poured 3 cups. She sat at her end of the table and opened her notebook and did not look at either of them in the particular way of someone who has witnessed something private and is choosing to treat it as ordinary, which is one of the more useful forms of respect. They worked through the morning. Wren laid out the 3 categories of evidence on the table between them, organized and indexed and cross-referenced with the precision of someone who had been trained by a man who understood that the difference between evidence that convinces and evidence that is dismissed is almost always a question of presentation and order. The biological evidence sample vials, slide preparations, the field notes documenting the distribution of Buphalus annulatus across the ranch correlated with proximity to the warm spring, the analysis confirming the parasite was not native to Montana's climate and could not have survived the winters without artificial maintenance of warm conditions. The buried hides documented with measurements and diagrams. The dating of the 3 separate deposits based on decomposition rates establishing a timeline of repeated deliberate action. The financial evidence, the property records from Missoula copied in Wren's hand with full citation of document number and date. 11 ranches, 5 years. The price differential in each case. The holding company. The name E. Pharaoh trustee appearing on every document. And the 1871 transfer, the oldest wound set apart from the others, with a single notation: original Pruitt family land transferred under fraudulent loan default. Roy's testimony. 12 pages of small, careful handwriting, every page dated and signed, covering specific conversations and transactions going back to 1871. Names, amounts, dates. The precise language of a former schoolteacher who understood that precision in language is not pedantry, but accuracy, and that accuracy is the only thing a testimony has to offer that cannot be disputed on grounds of interpretation. They organized it. They sequenced it. They determined the order of presentation. In the early afternoon, Clara Holt arrived. She came on foot, which was unusual for the distance, and she came through the back field rather than up the road, which was more unusual still. She knocked at the kitchen door, and Silas opened it, and she came in with the cold still on her coat and the look of someone who had made a decision and was not going to discuss whether the decision was wise. She was 28 years old with a deputy's badge on her coat and the direct manner of a woman who had spent 3 years in a job that required her to be twice as clear and twice as deliberate as any man doing the same work in order to be taken half as seriously. She put a folded document on the table. "The original copy of the 1878 property survey for the eastern Bitterroot parcels," she said. "It was in the sheriff's filing cabinet. He doesn't know I took it." Silas looked at this document. He looked at her. "You understand what this means for you if Harrington decides to make an issue of it." "I understand what it means for this ranch if I don't," she said. She looked at Wren. Wren looked at the document, and then at Clara with the evaluating attention she gave everything. Clara met the look without adjustment. "The surveyor who signed this document is still living in Missoula," Clara said. "He can confirm the original boundary descriptions. He remembers the survey because he told me once that it was the most contested survey he ever did. Someone kept disputing his measurements." "Faro," Wren said. "That's my understanding." Wren picked up her pen and made a note. "Can he be reached by morning?" "I sent a messenger at noon." Wren looked at Clara Holt with an expression that was for Wren almost warm. "Sit down," she said. "There's work." Clara sat down. They worked until the lamp was needed, and then by lamplight until Roy went to bed at 7, and then the three of them continued until 9, at which point Wren closed her notebook and said the preparation was as complete as it was going to be, and the rest depended on tomorrow. Silas walked Clara to the edge of the property. She would ride from there to town, she said. She would be back by 8 in the morning. "You don't have to come back," Silas said. Clara looked at him with the expression of someone being offered an exit they have already declined. "I know that," she said. She mounted her horse and rode into the dark. Silas stood in the yard for a moment after she was gone in the cold and the dark, and then he went inside. Wren was at the table, not working, just sitting with her hands around a cup of coffee that had gone cold. The notebooks and documents were stacked and ordered on the table in front of her, everything prepared and waiting. He sat across from her. She looked up. In the lamplight, her face was tired in the specific way of someone who has been working at maximum capacity for 9 days and has allowed themselves to stop long enough to feel it. Her hair had come loose from its pins at some point in the afternoon, and she had not bothered to reset it, and it was down around her shoulders in the way that suggested she had forgotten it was there, which was consistent with everything else he had observed about Wren Alcott's relationship with her own appearance, which was that it was entirely secondary to whatever she was thinking about. He thought about his father saying he didn't know that about himself anymore, meaning Silas, meaning that whatever Silas had been 3 years ago and 2 years ago and 1 year ago, a good man with the evidence buried under too much accumulated damage to find it was still in there, and Roy had known it and had waited for the right conditions to say so. He thought about Wren answering 17 matrimonial advertisements and 16 closed doors, and the 17th being his because she needed a desperate man and a dying ranch, and he had provided both. He thought about how the thing that had looked like his absolute ruin from the inside had looked from where she was standing like exactly what she required. He thought about the pine branch on the table and the coffee on the railing and the shoulder against his in the dark on the ridge above the valley, not touching, almost touching the specific and deliberate almost that was its own kind of statement. "Are you afraid?" he said. She considered the question honestly, which was how she considered everything. "No," she said. "I've been afraid before the Pennsylvania ranches, before Philadelphia, after my father died and I understood what I was carrying and that no one was going to help me carry it." She looked at the notebooks on the table. "This feels different. This feels like arriving somewhere." He looked at her. "It took you 17 tries to arrive." Something moved in her face that was not quite a smile, but was the shape a smile makes when it is held back by a person who is not entirely comfortable with the full version. 16 failures and 1 unconventional success," she said. "My father would have called that an acceptable experimental record." "Tell me about him," Silas said. She looked up with the expression of someone who has been asked the question they were not expecting, the question that goes directly to the thing they carry closest. And she told him. She talked for a long time, longer than he had heard her talk about anything, with the particular release of someone who has held something carefully for a very long time and has finally found the right place to set it down. She told him about Harlan Alcott in his laboratory, the way he talked to his microscope, the way he treated every discovery like a conversation with the natural world that had been waiting for someone to listen. She told him about the two of them working side by side in the evenings, the German reference texts, and the margin notes that were a dialogue across the years. She told him about the day the laboratory burned, the smell of it, the specific quality of the silence afterward. Her father standing in the street, looking at what was left with an expression she had never seen on him before and had not been able to name until much later, which was the expression of a man who has just understood that the world he believed in does not exist. She told him about the 10 months after the slow going out of her father, like a lamp being turned down one increment at a time. And she did not perform grief about this, and she did not try to make it into something bearable. She just told it as it was, which was the worst thing she had witnessed, and the thing she had been walking away from and toward simultaneously ever since. Silas listened to all of it. He did not offer consolations. He did not say he was sorry in the reflexive way that people say it to fill the space around grief. He just listened with the complete and undivided attention that was the particular gift of men who did not speak often, who understood that listening was not passive, but was its own kind of active engagement with whatever was being given. When she was finished, she looked at her cold coffee and then at him. "My turn," she said. He looked at her. "Tell me about Daniel," she said. He was quiet for a long moment. He had told her once on the ridge, and that telling had taken something out of him and put something back in simultaneously, the way setting down a weight and picking up a different one can feel like both relief and responsibility at once. This was different. This was not the single sentence on the ridge. This was the whole of it. He told her. He told her about Daniel at 4 years old, the specific quality of that age, the way children at 4 are completely present in every moment, no past pulling at them, and no future worrying them, just the absolute now of whatever is in front of them. He told her about Daniel's particular obsession with the creek behind the cabin, the way the boy could spend an entire afternoon moving water from one side of it to the other, with a tin cup completely absorbed, as if the redistribution of creek water was the most important work in the world. He told her about coming home from 3 days in the North Wilderness, and knowing before he reached the cabin door, knowing in the way the body knows things, before the mind is told that something had changed in the fundamental composition of the world. He told her about Ruth, not about her leaving, which was the part of the story that looked like abandonment from the outside but was not, was instead the act of a woman who understood that she and Silas were grieving in different directions, and that staying together in that divergence would eventually destroy them both. He told her about who Ruth had been before, and about the specific weight of watching someone you love reorganize themselves around a loss until you can no longer find the person you knew in the arrangement. He told her about the boots, about putting them on the table the morning after Ruth left. Not as a memorial and not as a punishment, but as something in between that he had never found a word for, a way of keeping a fact present and real in a world that required him to continue functioning. Wren listened to all of this with her hands around her cold coffee and her eyes on him, and she did not look away, and she did not offer the easy comfort of people who have not known this kind of loss, and therefore do not understand that easy comfort is its own form of dismissal. When he finished, she said, he would have walked every boundary line of this ranch by the time he was 10. Something moved through Silas's chest, something that had been held a long time. "Yes," he said, "he would have." They sat in the lamplight with the cold outside and the prepared evidence on the table between them and Roy sleeping in his room and tomorrow coming toward them, whether they were ready or not, and they did not speak for a long while after that, and the silence between them had in it something that had not been in it before, which was not less weight, but was weight differently held, carried by 2 people instead of 1, which makes it not lighter, but makes the carrying possible in a way that it was not before. The morning of the 10th day arrived at 9 degrees below freezing. Silas knew this because the thermometer his father had nailed to the porch post in 1874 still worked, and he had checked it at first light, which was a habit from years of needing to know what the cold was going to require of him. 9 below. Clear sky. No wind. The mountains to the west were sharp against a pale blue sky, every ridge and peak precise, the kind of clarity that comes only with extreme cold. He did not go down to the south pasture that morning. He had gone the night before and the night before that, and he knew what was there. He stood on the porch instead and looked at it from a distance, the dark shapes of the herd moving against the white ground in the ordinary way of animals that are not in pain, and he let that be enough. He had spent 3 years in the habit of preparing himself for the worst version of every morning. This morning he allowed himself for perhaps the first time to simply accept the best version without inspecting it for flaws. He took off his hat. The cold air moved across his forehead. He held the hat against his chest for a moment, the same gesture he had made 19 times over a dead animal in the past 4 months, and he made it now for a different reason entirely, which was gratitude, plain and without ceremony. Then he put his hat back on and went inside. He thought about Roy saying, "This is yours. Learn it." He thought about 9 years old walking boundary lines with his father, learning the corners by touch and repetition, being given the shape of a thing as a gift from a man who was simultaneously carrying the knowledge that the gift had already been taken. He put his hat back on. He went inside. Roy was at the table. White shirt, good trousers. The tin box sat open in front of him, the pages of testimony stacked neatly beside it, and Roy was reading through them with the concentrated attention of a man who is checking his work for the last time. He looked up when Silas came in. It was a very good day, one of the best Silas could remember in recent months, the full, sharp presence of his father's intelligence behind his eyes without qualification or delay. Silas sat down. They looked at each other. "The cattle are standing," Silas said. Roy looked at him steadily. Then he looked at the testimony in front of him and then back at his son, and the expression on his face was one that Silas had not seen in a long time, perhaps years. Perhaps since before Daniel, perhaps since before the slow erosion of memory had begun its work. It was the expression of a man who has arrived after a very long journey at a destination he was not certain he would reach. "Then let's finish this," Roy said. They were all at the table by 7, Silas and Wren and Roy, and by 8, Clara Holt was at the door, and by 8:30 Thomas Alcott had arrived from the Stevensville boarding house where he had been staying, and there were 5 of them around the table going through the sequence one final time, each piece in its place, each argument prepared. Thomas Alcott had arrived the previous afternoon while Silas and Wren were in the pasture. Wren had seen her brother from across the yard and stopped walking, and they had looked at each other across the frozen ground with the careful stillness of two people who have not spoken in more than a year and are calculating simultaneously the distance between where they left each other and where they need to be now. Thomas had crossed the yard and handed her a small wooden box tied with a leather cord. He had said, "He gave it to me the week before the laboratory burned. He said, give it to Wren when she finds somewhere safe to use it. I kept it safe. That's the only thing I did right." Wren had taken the box and held it and looked at her brother for a long moment. She had not said, "You are forgiven," because that was not a transaction that could be completed in a yard in Montana with a wooden box between them. What she had said was, "Come inside, there's work," which was coming from Wren Alcott close enough. The wooden box had contained her father's second research journal, the one she had not known existed. The record of his attempts to document the political and financial mechanics of the suppression of his findings, names and dates and transactions, the kind of evidence that required a different kind of courage to gather than scientific evidence required, the kind of courage that had ultimately cost him what it cost him. On the last page in handwriting that was shakier than the earlier entries, the accumulated damage of the preceding months already present in the trembling of his pen a list. Names, dates, transactions. And at the top, the first name, the organizing name, the one that connected every other item on the list. Edmund Farrow, 1878. First contact. Wren had read this at the kitchen table at midnight and then closed the journal and sat with her hands flat on the cover for a long time. She did not cry. She had cried for her father already in the months after his death in the particular private way of people who need to complete their grief in solitude, and what she felt now was not grief, but something colder and more purposeful. The specific resolution that comes when the last piece of a long investigation finally presents itself. She had added the journal to the evidence stack. She had gone to bed. She had slept for 4 hours. Now it was 9 o'clock on the 10th morning, and the evidence was in its order, and the people were in their places, and Edmund Farrow was on the valley road. They heard the horses before they saw them. Silas heard it first, which was consistent with years of training his hearing to the specific sounds of approach across open ground. He stood from the table and went to the window and looked out at the valley road and came back. 4 horses, he said. Farrow's carriage, 2 riders behind. He looked at Wren. She was already closing the final notebook and stacking the last document with a precise alignment that was entirely unnecessary and entirely characteristic the physical expression of a mind that organizes itself for clarity under pressure. "Roy," Silas said. His father stood. He picked up the testimony pages, 12 of them, and tapped them against the table to even the edges, and folded them once and placed them in the breast pocket of his white shirt. He buttoned the pocket. He stood straight. Silas looked at him. Roy looked back. Something passed between them that required no words and would not have been improved by any. They went outside. The cold hit them all as they came through the door 9 below, making itself known at every exposed surface, the kind of cold that focuses the mind considerably. They arranged themselves on the porch and in the yard in the natural way of people who have been working toward a moment and understand without discussion where they should be in it. Silas stood at the top of the porch steps. Wren stood to his left with the wooden evidence box under her arm. Roy sat in his chair that Silas had carried out onto the porch upright, and still, his hands folded in his lap, looking out at the yard with the patient attention of a man who has been waiting a long time for this particular morning. Clara stood to the right with her deputy's badge visible and her hands at her sides. Thomas stood in the yard below, having positioned himself there of his own accord, understanding without being told that his presence at the edge of the gathering rather than its center was the correct form of his contribution. Pharaoh's carriage came into the yard. He descended from it with the ease of a man who has done this many times, wearing his good wool overcoat and carrying himself with the particular settled authority of someone who has been correct about the outcome of a great many situations and has no reason to expect this one to be different. 2 hired men on horseback remained behind him. With Pharaoh was a lawyer whose name Silas did not know, and a man from the bank whose name was Clement, who had the look of someone who would have preferred to be elsewhere and understood that his preference was not relevant. Pharaoh looked at the arrangement on the porch and in the yard. His eyes moved across Wren and the evidence box and Clara's badge and Thomas Alcott and came to rest on Silas. "Morning, Silas," he said. His voice was warm, as it always was, the warmth of long practice. "I take it you've had time to consider the situation." "I have," Silas said. "Then I imagine you understand that the deadline has arrived and the circumstances are what they are. I've brought Clement from the bank and Mr. Aldrich here has the transfer documents. This doesn't need to be unpleasant." He looked at Wren. "I'd suggest your wife take her belongings inside while we conclude the business. No reason she should have to stand in this cold." Wren said, "Mr. Pharaoh." Her voice was clear and perfectly even, carrying across the yard without effort, the voice of someone who has spent years in rooms where she was required to be twice as audible as anyone else in order to be heard at all. Pharaoh looked at her. "Before Mr. Clement presents any documents," Wren said, "I need you to look at something." She opened the evidence box and removed the first document. Not the most dramatic. Not the journal with his name on the last page. The first document, the one that established the framework, the property records from Missoula. She held it out to Sheriff's Deputy Clara Holt, not to Pharaoh. "Deputy Holt," she said, "these are certified copies of the Territorial Property Registry records from Missoula. 11 land transfers in the Bitterroot Valley between 1878 and 1883. In each case, the transfer followed a period of documented livestock illness. In each case, the purchasing entity was the same Territorial Land Trust. In each case, the authorized signatory was Edmund Pharaoh." Clara took the documents and looked at them. The lawyer Aldrich shifted his weight. Clement from the bank had gone very still. "That's public record," Pharaoh said. His voice was still even. "Land acquisition is not a crime, miss, whatever your name is." "Alcott," Wren said. "Wren Alcott. My father was Dr. Harlan Alcott, whose research for the Division of Entomology of the United States Department of Agriculture you were instrumental in suppressing in 1878. She removed the second document. "These are the financial records documenting the freezing of his research accounts through Missoula National Bank. The authorizing signature on 3 of the 4 account freezes is yours." The warmth in Pharaoh's expression had not left entirely, but it had moved the way weather moves imperceptibly until it has moved completely. "The research," he said, "was inconclusive and politically motivated." "The research," Wren said, "was correct, and its correctness is demonstrated by this ranch, which has been deliberately infected with Buphalus annulatus larvae through the engineered incubation of infested southern cattle hides buried in the geothermal spring on the southern boundary of this property." She removed the third document. The diagram of the spring, the measurements, the decomposition dating. 3 separate deposits, she said. The oldest consistent with placement in early spring of this year, the most recent consistent with placement in October. Someone came back, Mr. Pharaoh, to refresh the supply, because a single deposit in a location with geothermal activity at this latitude would have degraded within months without maintenance. The lawyer Aldrich said quietly to Pharaoh, "Edmund." Pharaoh did not look at him. "This is fabrication," Pharaoh said. His voice had thinned. The warmth was gone. What was underneath was not rage, which would have been easier, but something colder and more calculating. the response of a man who is accustomed to managing difficult situations and is now running through his options at speed. "Then, there is the matter," Wren said, "of the 1871 transfer." She removed the document and held it up so that the people in the yard could see it. The original survey document that Clara had brought, the certified copy of the transfer record, Roy's testimony folded in his breast pocket. "The original Pruitt family land," she said, "transferred under a fraudulent loan default that was manufactured through the falsification of payment records at the predecessor institution to Missoula National. The surveyor who conducted the original boundary survey in 1871 is alive and available to testify that his measurements were repeatedly disputed by a party he has identified as you. The testimony of Roy Pruitt, former school teacher and member of the 1878 Territorial Agricultural Committee, documents this transaction in specific and dated detail." She stopped. The yard was very quiet. Then Roy stood up. He stood up from his chair on the porch with the careful deliberateness of a man who understands that this movement is significant and intends to perform it with the full dignity it requires. He did not need help. He walked to the top of the porch steps and stopped there, one hand on the railing, and looked down at Edmund Farrow in the yard below. He said only the man's name. Edmund. One word. The name of a man he had called a friend for 30 years and watched become something that a friend cannot be while still being called one. Farrow looked up at him, and in that look, in the specific quality of it, in the way Edmund Farrow's face reorganized itself around the sight of Roy Pruitt standing straight and clear-eyed in a white shirt on a cold morning, something happened that no document and no testimony had accomplished. The careful constructed surface of Farrow's authority showed its seam. Roy removed the folded pages from his breast pocket. 12 pages, he said, written on the days I still remember clearly. Everything I witnessed and everything I know. Signed and dated. He held them out to Clara Holt. "I was a school teacher for 22 years. I know how to write a clear account of specific events. You can verify every date and every amount." Clara took the pages. Farrow's lawyer said, "Edmund, I need to advise you to stop talking." Farrow was not talking. He was looking at Roy Pruitt with an expression that had nothing calculated in it anymore, that was simply the expression of a man looking at the accumulated consequence of 30 years of choices and understanding, perhaps for the first time with full clarity, the weight of what he had made. "I was your friend," Roy said. "It was not an accusation. It was a statement of fact offered with the particular sadness of someone who has been carrying the memory of a friendship that ended long before it was acknowledged to have ended." Farrow looked at the ground. It was the lawyer who spoke very quietly to no one in particular. "The documents speak for themselves, and I am not in a position to represent any claim that has been demonstrated to rest on fraudulent foundations." He stepped back. Clement from the bank said, "I'll need to communicate with the territorial office before any transfer can proceed." He was already moving toward his horse. The two hired men behind Farrow had said nothing throughout all of this. They looked at each other. They looked at the situation. They looked at the specific legal and moral geometry of where they were standing and what they had been hired in connection with, and they reached independently and without discussion the same conclusion. They turned their horses and rode out of the yard. Farrow stood alone in the yard. He was 68 years old, and he had come in from Ohio with nothing, and built something and then built something else on top of that. And the something else had required the destruction of other things. And he had told himself for 30 years that this was simply the way the world worked, for men who refused to be destroyed by it themselves. He had believed this with the conviction of someone who needs a justification to be complete and watertight, because the alternative is to know, which he had never allowed himself to do. He looked at Silas. He looked at him for a long moment. "Your father," he said, "was the best man I knew." Silas said nothing. "That didn't stop me," Farrow said. "I want you to understand that. Not because it excuses it, but because you're a young man, and you should understand what a person is capable of when they've decided that survival justifies the method." He looked at Roy one more time. Roy looked back. The look between them contained 30 years of everything that had been, and Clara Holt and her territorial authority, and the weight of 12 pages of testimony, and the understanding that whatever had existed between these two men was over now in every way that a thing can be over. Farrow turned and walked to his carriage. He did not run. He did not argue further. He had his hand on the carriage door when Clara spoke. "Mr. Farrow." Her voice was not loud. It did not need to be. It carried the particular quality of someone who has been waiting 3 years to say something that matters and has finally arrived at the moment. You are not to leave Montana Territory. The Territorial Marshal's office in Helena has received advance notification of this complaint and is expecting written confirmation by Friday. If you are not available for interview when the investigator arrives, that unavailability will be documented in the formal record as evidence of flight. She paused. I would encourage you to be available. Farrow stood with his hand on the carriage door. He did not turn around. After a moment he climbed up and took the reins and drove out of the yard at the same measured pace he had arrived, with the pace of a man who understands that running would confirm everything and that the only remaining dignity available to him is to leave slowly. The gate closed behind him. Clara looked at the empty road for a moment. Then she opened her notebook and began writing quickly and in full, while everything was still exact in her memory. She would ride to Helena before nightfall. The investigator assigned to the case had been waiting on her word. He would not wait much longer. Thomas had provided the contact at the marshal's office 3 days earlier, and the investigator who would handle the case had already received a preliminary communication. What happened next would take months. Courts, documentation, the slow grinding process of territorial law. But it would happen. The yard was quiet after the carriage was gone. The cold sat around them. Above the western peaks, the morning light was moving towards something that might eventually become warmth, the particular pale promise of late winter in Montana when the season is thinking about changing. Silas stood at the top of the porch steps and looked at the empty yard and the road that led away from Coldwater Ranch into the valley, and then beyond the valley, into the world which had arranged itself very badly around his land for a long time, and had today, through a combination of documentation and testimony, and the absolute refusal of several people to accept its arrangements as final, been required to rearrange itself. He felt Wren come to stand beside him. He did not look at her. He looked out at the pasture where Goliath stood in the thin winter sunlight, large and scarred and alive, eating frozen grass with the complete absorption of an animal that has no investment in the significance of the morning. It holds, Silas said. Yes, Wren said. He looked at her then. She was looking at the pasture, at the living animals, at the ground of Coldwater Ranch, and her expression had in it something he had not seen in the 9 days he had been observing her face with the careful attention it deserved. It was not triumph. It was the expression of someone who has arrived after a very long journey through some very difficult country at a place where they can stop moving and look around and find that the place is real. She was still holding the evidence box under her arm. He reached over and took it from her, not because it was heavy, but because she had been holding it for a long time and he was there and it was something he could do. She let him take it. They stood on the porch together in the cold and the winter light, and Roy sat back down in his chair behind them and closed his eyes in the thin sun, and Clara rode out of the yard, and Thomas stood at the edge of the property for a moment before walking toward the barn to do the ordinary work of the morning, which was also his way of saying that he understood this place was not his, and this was not his story to stand at the center of, but that he was here and intended to be useful, which was perhaps the beginning of something. 3 months later, when the snow had left the valley floor and the Bitterroot Mountains were showing their first green below the tree line, and the cattle on Coldwater Ranch had been certified healthy by the Territorial Agricultural Board following a formal review of Wren's field trial documentation, a letter arrived from the Division of Entomology in Washington. Silas brought it in from the post at Stevensville and set it on the kitchen table beside the morning coffee. Wren was at her end of the table with the microscope and her notebooks, which was where she was every morning now, working on the formal write-up of the Coldwater Ranch trial results for submission to the division. It was the most comprehensive field documentation of bovine tick eradication by chemical treatment that existed in the United States at that time, and she had been told this by 2 different people who knew what they were talking about. And she had accepted this information with the same precision she applied to everything which was to note it as accurate and return to the work. She looked at the envelope. She opened it. She read it. She set it down on the table. Roy was having a good morning. He was at his end of the table with his coffee and the Helena newspaper, which he could read on the good days, and he looked at her over the top of it with the knowing attention he had been directing at her since the first evening. "Washington," he said. "They want me to present the trial results in September," she said, "and to consult on a national protocol for tick eradication." Roy lowered the newspaper. "Will you go?" She looked at the letter. She looked at the microscope. She looked at the window and the morning outside it, the green coming back into the world after the long winter, the cattle moving in the south pasture, Goliath visible as a large dark shape against the brightening sky. She looked at the small leather boots on their shelf where Silas had placed them 3 weeks ago on the morning after Roy had said what he said to his son at this table on the morning when something in Silas had moved from one position to another that could not be moved back from. The boots were on the shelf now with the small pine branch and its cones properly placed, honored and present, and no longer serving as pennants. She heard Silas outside, the sound of him crossing the yard with the particular rhythm she could identify in her sleep. Now the long even stride, the slight variation in weight at the heel from an old ankle injury he had never mentioned and she had noticed on the third day. He came through the door and stopped when he saw her face. "What is it?" he said. She slid the letter across the table. He read it. He set it down. He looked at her with the direct, unhurried attention that was his particular gift, the capacity to look at a thing completely without the need to immediately do something about it. "When?" he said. "September." He was quiet for a moment, the way he was quiet when he was thinking rather than managing. Then he went to the stove and poured himself coffee and came back to the table and sat down and looked at the letter again. "You'll need good traveling clothes," he said. "The ones you came in are holding together, but they won't do for Washington." She looked at him. "I'll be back," she said. "After the presentation, I'll be back." He looked at her across the table, across the notebooks and the microscope and the evidence of 9 days that had changed the shape of both of their lives, across the small distance that was no longer the careful measured distance of two people being cautious, but was the ordinary close distance of two people who have decided to occupy the same world. "I know that," he said. He stood up. He looked around the kitchen at the table and the shelf and the window and the modest, ordinary, persistent life of the place, and then he looked at Wren. "I need to build a proper workspace for you," he said. "The kitchen table isn't adequate for what you're doing. There's a room on the east side of the cabin that gets good light all morning. I've been thinking about it." Wren looked at him. "How long have you been thinking about it?" she said. He considered. "Since the third day." She was quiet for a moment. Then she picked up her pen and turned back to her notebooks and said, without looking up, in a voice that was doing something that was not quite its ordinary flatness, "The east room will need shelving. I have a considerable number of books." "I know that," he said. He put on his coat and went outside. Roy lowered his newspaper and looked at the space where his son had been standing. He looked at Wren at the table, her pen moving across the page with its small, precise strokes, the morning light from the window falling across the work. He looked at the leather boots on the shelf. He looked at the pine branch and its cones dry now and holding their shape. He picked up his coffee and held it in both hands and looked at the window and the green coming back into the world outside it. And he nodded once with the slow satisfaction of someone who has been waiting a long time for a particular morning to arrive, and found that when it came, it was exactly what he had been waiting for. Outside on the other side of the wall, Silas Pruitt walked across the yard of Coldwater Ranch in the spring light on the ground that had always been his toward the east side of the cabin where the morning sun fell best, already measuring in his mind what the space would require. The mountains stood around the valley as they always had, enormous and indifferent and permanent. The ground held.